If you go back to your childhood and your memories from childhood, you can remember your uncles or your aunties or those adults that were kind to you, that were very playful with you, that would make it a point to joke with you, that would make you feel welcome. And children have a way of detecting that, right? They feel kindness or they feel unwanted very easily. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ stresses, لَيْسَ مِنَّا مَنْ لَمْ يَرْحَمْ صَغِيرَنَا وَيُوَقِّرْ كَبِيرَنَا. The Prophet ﷺ says that he is not amongst us who fails to show mercy to the young ones and at the same time upholds the respect for the elderly. Anas ibn Malik radiallahu ta'ala anhu says, I never saw anyone more merciful with children than the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I mean, when you brought your children around the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would do everything but ignore them. He would play with them sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He would talk to them sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that helps each one of the children develop their own connection, especially to the masjid, right? You talk about making the children love the masjid, going to the masjid and seeing that kind adult, and especially if there is a sweet imam or a kind imam. And in the case of the Prophet ﷺ being your imam, your child wants to go see the Prophet ﷺ because they know that the Prophet ﷺ is going to talk to them. They know that the Prophet ﷺ might give them something. They know that the Prophet ﷺ is going to be playful with them. So that's really part of the culture that the Prophet ﷺ is setting up in his community. And Anas radiallahu ta'ala anhu says he used to mix with us so much that he would ask a little brother of mine, Ya Aba Umair, ma fa'ala al-Nughayr. I had a younger brother named Aba Umair, and he had a little bird, a Nughayr. And the Prophet ﷺ, every time he saw him, he'd ask him about his pet. He'd ask him about his pet bird, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and take interest in it, right? So when you're walking up to kids and you're talking to children and you're asking them about their interests, you're asking them about how far they've gotten in their game, about how things are going in their sports or whatever it may be that they're doing. So the Prophet ﷺ would develop that type of relationship with the children of the community. Those children, of course, who would grow up to become the scholars of this ummah, right? Because they were young enough to be sahaba, and at the same time they learned whatever they could from the elder companions and transmitted that to the next generation of eager tabi'een, the next generation that came in this ummah. So how did this start off with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Well, for one, if you had a child and you lived in Medina, you wanted to bring your newborn to the Prophet ﷺ. You wanted the Prophet ﷺ to name your child for you. You wanted the Prophet ﷺ to hold your child and make dua. You wanted the Prophet ﷺ to do the tahniq, where he would take the date ﷺ and rub it on the top of the mouth of the child. You wanted that from the Prophet ﷺ, and he would oblige alayhi salatu wasalam. Anas radiallahu ta'ala anhu mentions Abdullah, the son of Abu Talha, and he says that when he was born, the Prophet ﷺ held him and he took the date and he put it in his mouth and he put it in the mouth of Abdullah. And Abdullah really loved that date. So the Prophet ﷺ said, Hubbul Ansar at-Tamr. This is how the Ansar are. They love dates. And the Prophet ﷺ named him Abdullah. So you had all these children that were walking around that were actually named by the Prophet ﷺ. And when the Prophet ﷺ saw the Abyssinian children, he would try to speak their language ﷺ, and he would stumble speaking their language, sometimes on purpose, so that they could laugh with him ﷺ as he was trying to speak their language. A child could take him by the hand ﷺ and show him things and point out things to him. And the Prophet ﷺ would play with them, and Rasulullah ﷺ would not turn away from them until they were satisfied. We also see, subhanAllah, a really beautiful narration, because sometimes these things are actually, in the small print, if you will, of a hadith. When the Prophet ﷺ used to receive fruits, now back then, obviously, probably for better, you don't really have candy, right? The sweet is the fruit, and the kids loved fruits. And in Medina, when people would have their new picks of fruit, they would always want to bring something to the Prophet ﷺ. And Rasulullah ﷺ, when he would get a piece of fruit, he would make dua for the fruits of those people, the fruits of Al-Madinah. And then the Prophet ﷺ would do what? He'd look to the smallest child in sight, he'd call that child over, and he'd give them the fruit, alayhi salatu wasalam. So that was like his way of giving candy, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to the children of the ummah. And this was his habit, alayhi salatu wasalam, even as people would prefer the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with those sweet fruits. Now, with his own children, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that was a sight to see in and of itself, meaning his grandchildren, alayhi salatu wasalam. When it comes to Al-Hassan and Hussein radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma, the Prophet ﷺ's relationship with them was so beautiful. And the Prophet ﷺ would not just hold them and testify to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala how much He loves them, but He would say loudly sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Oh Allah, love those who love them," and hold them sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and He would kiss them alayhi salatu wassalam. Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha, she mentions when the Prophet ﷺ used to visit the house and he'd call out, "Atamma luka', where's the little one at? Where's the little one at?" And he means sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Atamma luka'," he means sallallahu alaihi wasallam al-Hasan radiallahu ta'ala anhu, "Bring him out to me." And the Prophet ﷺ would put in his own cloak alayhi salatu wassalam Al-Hasan and Al-Hussein and Usama ibn Zayd and Zainab and Umama. He would put all of his grandchildren alayhi salatu wassalam under his cloak, and he would hold them close and he would make dua. And this was a sight that was changing the culture of Al-Madinah. There was a man that once saw the Prophet ﷺ throwing Al-Hasan and Hussein and kissing them and hugging them, and he said, "I have 10 of them and I never kissed any of them. Like, this is not normal. You know, we're men, we're not supposed to kiss our children." And the Prophet ﷺ said, "What can I do about a man who has no mercy? You know, whoever does not show mercy will not have mercy shown to them." So the Prophet ﷺ said, this is part of rahmah, this is part of mercy that we show to these children. And the Prophet ﷺ especially paid attention to those orphans, to those children that were deprived of that love. The Prophet ﷺ would go out of his way to be that figure to those orphans that didn't have the love of a father, because he ﷺ did not have that love himself. He grew up without that. And he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "The best house is the one in which orphans are treated well, and the worst house is the one in which orphans are treated poorly." So just like when he talked about feasts being exclusive and the worst feasts being the ones that the poor are excluded from, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that the worst houses are the ones in which the orphans are not treated well. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam made it a point to be that emotional support and to bring them close sallallahu alaihi wasallam emotionally, so that they could feel that connection. And that's why he told Abu Darda radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he said, "Do you want your heart to be softened? Do you want to find that your things will be provided for you in life?" He says, "Adnil yatima mink, bring the orphan close to you. Wamsah bi ra'sihi wa at'imhu min ta'amik, and caress his hair and feed him from what you eat." And he said, "Wallahi, it will soften your heart and it will fulfill your needs." So the Prophet ﷺ would go out and he would bring the aitam, he'd bring the orphans to his own home sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He would walk with them, and because they were so subject to exploitation, the Prophet ﷺ would not just play with them, but he would intercede for them for any issue that they had sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he pays special attention to children as a whole in the ummah, and he pays even closer attention sallallahu alaihi wasallam to those children that were not getting to live like the children around them.